Welcome, everyone, to today's Scaling with People podcast. Question for you. Did you know that average small businesses selling to the government receive $2.35 million in contracts? If that doesn't blow your mind, I don't know what will. I'm super excited to have Ricky Howard on the call today. He's a retired USAF acquisition officer who's going to tell us a little bit more. Ricky, nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you too. Thanks for having me on today.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your background, and then let's dive into how our listeners can start looking into working with the government.
Oh yeah, no, I could geek out about this for probably longer than this podcast wants to be on. But yeah, no, my name's Ricky Howard, as you said, and I spent 20 years in the Air Force. About half of that was flying reconnaissance aircraft. But as a lot of us do, eventually I switched into more of a staff position. And for me, the rest of my career was as an acquisitions officer. So it was my job to put companies on contract for the government and then manage those companies. And we're not just talking about weapons. We're talking about everything from, accounting services, civil engineering, software, a lot of the things that maybe your audience actually sells, the government's using. And they're the single biggest purchaser of goods and services in the world. And as you pointed out at the beginning, the average small business that sells to the government makes over $2 million on average, if we average them all together. It's very lucrative, and the government has to buy from small businesses. Not only that, and this is probably why I do what I do now, less than half of 1% of small businesses in the country are actually selling to the government or even know that the government buys what they sell. And so when I retired in 2019, I started a business. We have DoD Contract Academy. And so we help small businesses sell products and services, technology to the US government. We've advised over 400 companies. And we also, and I told you at the beginning here, we just launched a new tool called GovClose. And at GovClose, this is the first CRM and pipeline tool that has been specifically designed to kind of marry training and a pipelining system for a company. So it really simple, walks them step by step through the process. So yeah, no, we're really excited. And I'd love to get into it and answer any questions you have.
I love that. But I'm going to go back to what you said earlier. You said the government has to work with small business. What is that about?
So the government does not buy things the way that, me and you would buy something. Right?
Of course.
They can't go down. If I want to buy a car, you want to buy a car, I can go to my buddy's dealership and buy one. But basically, the government's been regulating this since the birth of the country. So there are some very specific ways that the government goes about how they're going to make a purchase, right? And most of that regulation exists to prevent corruption, right? To prevent corruption from the government. So prevent a general from handing his buddy a $200 million contract. Also to prevent contractors from, not performing the services that they're supposed to or delivering the goods that they agreed to deliver to the government. But part of that regulation is that we have basically standards that we have to meet on the government side, meaning a certain percentage of their contracting has to go to small businesses. And roughly it's 23%. It's a little bit different for each agency. But so if you figure that the government is the single biggest purchaser of goods and services in the world, and 23% of what they're buying has to be from small businesses, and they buy everything that you could think of, now you have a huge opportunity that only a very small percentage of companies are taking advantage of. So that's what I meant by that. There are quotas essentially that the government has to hit with small business contracts, and we could dive deep on that. There's other quotas for like woman-owned small businesses and service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses, and there's other categories.
Yeah, that makes sense. I appreciate that clarification. So I guess being a small business owner myself, I kind of go, well, how do I figure out if I can sell my services, my tools, my software, my product?
Yeah.
What's the process that a startup founder should be looking for to figure this out?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's take your business, right? Because you're in human resources, right? HR. Yeah. And that covers a lot of different things, right? The management of personnel. There's also software tools used for HR, and there's probably 100 things that I don't know about because that's what
recruiting people.
Yeah, recruiting people, exactly. And you know what? The government recruits people. The military recruits people. Every organization has people that are doing HR work, and we also have software and technology that does. And I've been involved with some of those purchases on the commercial side, actually, because I've also sold software to the government. So Not quite the question you asked. You asked how I would find out about this. So if I had an HR business, there's a couple of things that I would want to know. And this is what I tell my clients. Before you attempt to sell to the government, first, let's see if the government buys what you sell. And a good way to do that for free is to go to a website called usaspending.gov. And that's basically the website that provides the US citizens with an overview of government spending. So if I go to usaspending.gov, there's a few ways that I could check for human resources, right? There, I could type in the keyword, and it also allows you to check by year. So I usually go back about 5 years because, if you're checking, if you look at what the government was buying in 2005, it's not the same as what they're buying today. So go back about 5 years, and you could also look for, there's something called a North American Industry Classification Code, NAICS. Yep. There's a drop-down menu for that and for also product service codes. You, for instance, could try typing in human resources. There are other keywords, I'm sure, associated with your profession. So there may be a NAICS code, a product service code associated specifically for HR. But if there isn't, you can check by keyword and get a snapshot of what the government is spending. And if I had to guess, with human resources, we would probably be talking about, if not hundreds of millions of dollars a year, we're probably looking at billions of dollars over the past few years. So, and that would cover everything from actual services to technology, software tools that manage HR, like I was talking about. If you started digging into some of those contracts, you could see, and this is what's great about it, I could see exactly what percentage of those contracts are with small businesses. If I had a woman-owned small business, well, which ones were with women-owned small businesses? Which agencies are purchasing from companies like mine? You can get very granular. You could see what's in the contracts to a certain extent. Is it services? Is it technology? And you could see, how that matches up with what you're selling.
I love it. That is such a great tool. I'm definitely going to check that out for sure.
Yeah. No, I think the government would be a little gold mine for you.
Well, and probably for every listener that has a small business. I mean, again, we're talking about 21. I mean, this is a 2-year-old stats almost, right? Or almost at the end of 23. And 2.35 million for a small business owner is nothing to sneeze on. That's for sure.
Yeah, I would say that, most of the businesses I work with end up doing better than that. That's an average, right? So if because we can see how many small businesses and the total amount of spending. And the reason you have a 2021 stat is that one thing the government likes to do is take their time, right? So all of the reporting does take time. So it's right now we're in fiscal year 24 because the government fiscal year starts in October. So, and we're probably just getting a clear vision of what was actually done in 22. And we probably won't know about FY23's numbers for, 6 months. We'll have an idea, but, those numbers seem to change, as time goes on. So,
yeah, that makes sense. Appreciate that. So how does a founder start to leverage these kinds of contracts? Like, what is the next step? Okay, I go on the website, I see, oh my gosh, like they're using services like mine, software tools that I'm selling, product that I'm selling. Now it's time for me to go out and figure out, like, how do I get a piece of this pie? What does that process look like?
Yeah, so it's a great question. The first thing, after you have confirmed that the government does indeed buy the type of thing that you're selling or service, whatever it is, now you need to register your business to sell to the government. And for that, you would go to a website called sam.gov. It's another government website. And there's a process there. Yeah. And it's not the best, it's not the most friendly website. But it is not, you don't need somebody to help you register to the government. It'll tell you right on there. There's a button that says this is where you click to register, and it will tell you the things that you need when you begin the process, like your tax identification number for your business. And there's some other things. And then it'll take a couple of weeks probably for that to go through, but it will. And then you'll be officially registered to sell to the government. So that's step number one, is register your business. Now, the steps that come after that are not as intuitive, right, as maybe registering. And that's because of how the process works. So if I had to give one piece of advice that I would want your listeners to take away, is that when you go to sam.gov, a lot of businesses make the mistake of because you can look, that's where the government will put out things like requests for proposals, requests for quotes. Those are official government solicitations. And probably the biggest mistake I see is companies register, they see those solicitations, and just like in the movie War Dogs, they start writing proposals and expecting to win. And then they don't win, and they don't win. And they see their competitors winning. And they see some of those solicitations, now that they've been doing it a few times, they look like they were written for their competitors. And now they think it's rigged. And, then they throw their hands up in the air and walk away. The problem with that method is in government acquisitions, when the solicitation comes out, that's when the handcuffs are on the government offices. Everything's set. The funding is set. The requirements are set. The government is not going to talk to you or give you any special treatment, or even if they answer a question for you, it's probably going to be in a publicly disclosed document that everybody can read, usually through sam.gov. But the reason is they do not want to be seen as giving any special preference for a company, because there's a lot of things that can happen after that if they do. But before that solicitation comes out, there's something called the market research phase. And that's where the government has to be able to talk to businesses and people like you, right? So if I just put my Air Force program manager hat on for a second, right? So if I was in charge of modernizing the Air Force human resources technical solution, right? There's no way that I would know as the government program manager or contracting officer what the best practices were, what the technology is. I was flying planes before I did that, right? So I had no idea. So what that market research phase allows me to do is I can put things out called a sources sought. I can reach out to you directly. This is an opportunity for you as a business owner. And this is what the savvy business owners do, is they find the offices that buy what they sell in the market research phase, and they create those conversations. They give demonstrations. They respond to sources sought. There's a lot you could do to influence. There's a lot you could do to create a relationship, much like you would in a regular sales process. But of course, we're finding that through opportunity and funding. So it's just a little bit different the way we go about it, but that's how companies are winning contracts. And that's really where your listeners want to be.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what are the steps like in regards to when you're got that RFP going, kind of like maybe you've been able to do the market research, connect with someone, built that relationship, and now it's in RFP mode. Kind of what's high level? We won't get into the nitty gritty because I know there's a lot, but like just kind of some of the things for a newbie to kind of expect that process to look like.
Yeah. So, and it's just that question. It's the reason we built GovClose, because we needed, like, if you probably use a CRM tool with your business, right? Like, I don't know, Salesforce or HubSpot or something. And the steps in there, you put an opportunity in, it's a lead. And then maybe the next one is, I don't know, it's a lead with more significant value, or you've had a conversation and then you're negotiating close, and then it's close. But there are so many of those steps, like you're talking about, that are not intuitive, that are not part of a traditional sales process, that we created each of the pipelines based on what your business does, right? So let's take sources sought, because this is what I always recommend people to take. So if you went in there and you clicked on the sources sought pipeline, you'd start with how to find a sources sought, and has training to kind of help them do that. Then you go through a go, no go, which is also probably similar to a normal sales process, right? Does my company really want to go after this? But then there are things in there like calling the point of contact for the government. And these are the questions you want to ask. You want to know if the government is funded for this opportunity. You want to know what their timeline is for contracting. You want to know what their use cases are, because the information that is included in the government solicitations or the sources sought is not going to be all the information, right? So it's a lot of work to put those together. You're going to get a little piece of it, but if you have a conversation with someone, you're going to have a lot more information. So it walks you through a lot of steps like that, and then of course assembling that. What can we put in there? What can't we put in there? Because that's going to be different than what you put in an official government proposal. But so these are some just examples of steps. We're setting up meetings. We are submitting things like sources sought. We're monitoring for the solicitation release. We're writing a proposal that makes sense. We're using a compliance matrix to make sure that we're not ad-libbing, because that's something where you can't. It's not something you can basically approach subjectively if you're writing a proposal for the government. That is very strict, and you want to adhere to their standards, or it may be eliminated. So, and then of course, following up and things like that afterwards, and how you actually get awarded. There are some specific steps to that. So. Those are the type of things that you might be looking at in that type of pipeline, which are going to be different than, say, if you were a subcontractor, right? There's a different way to approach it that way, because you might be approaching other companies as well and finding opportunities. So it's a mixture. It just really depends on your business and how you're going to approach.
Yeah, that's such a great call out between prime and subcontractor
Yeah,
relationship with the government. Yeah, for
absolutely.
sure. So what do you see? I know that, you shared that website. You can check to see if your services or products are being used. But what do you see as being the most common products and services that the government's spending money on?
Ooh, that's, it's tough to say because it changes by agency, right?
Oh,
So
sure, that makes sense.
yeah. So, I mean, if we were looking at an agency like the VA, the Veterans Affairs Agency, they spend a lot of money on construction and on hospital supplies and medicine and things of like, because they're taking care of a lot of veterans, right? So
Yeah.
there are a lot of services like that and a lot of products that are purchased versus something like the Air Force. I could tell you software, technology, IT, cyber, those are huge spends. But it's not all tech like that. There's a lot of money spent across the different agencies on things like accounting services and legal services and human relations, HR services. There's a lot of commodities that they have to buy. Everything that goes into a grocery store, right? A good way to think about it is, especially with the Department of Defense, which accounts for about half of that small business spending. Every base is basically a small town or city, depending on the footprint of the base. And it has all the things that your town or city probably has. They have hospitals, they have a police department, a fire department, supermarkets, they have office buildings with a lot of civilians and government people working in. They have gas stations, and restaurants. So they have all of this stuff. And you could think of it that way. Like there's so many different industries that the government is purchasing from, that it's really tough to say, what is the number one thing? Because for you, they might not even need to spend that much of it. You might find a niche where the government's spending $50 million a year. But if it's a very narrow niche and there's only a couple of companies providing goods or services in that area, then that's probably all you need.
Yeah, that's so true. So what do you see are the common challenges that small businesses face as they start to come down, start to go down this path? And are those challenges less so as they start to get awarded a contract, their second contract?
Yep. No, that's a good question. So I think the first is just understanding the process. So you want to get a good understanding of what you need to do. And you don't have to go out and spend a bunch of money for that. You can, we have a DoD Contract Academy podcast you can listen to. It's free. And we walk through most of the steps that you need to know to sell to the government in that podcast. And we also interview small businesses that are actually out there winning big contracts. So you can get some information that way. There are some other great repositories online. Outside of just learning the process, I would say that be prepared for the long haul, right? So selling to the government can be extremely lucrative, but it's not fast. Okay, so you need to be prepared for a 12 to 18 month timeline of trying to sell to the government. And that might just mean identifying one opportunity and walking it through the steps you need to with a government office, developing that relationship and waiting for the funding to drop. You might get to the point where the government wants to hire you, but they need to wait 4 months before they get this year's funding so they can put you on contract. So just be prepared for that type of timeline. And if you have that in mind and that, I don't have to be working 8 hours a day for a year to go on contract. It might just be, a couple of emails on Monday and, following up on Wednesday and doing something else on a couple of different opportunities. But eventually you're going to get there. The next thing that I would say is, and I think it answers your next question is, what do you do? Does it get easier, right, when you're already on contract? And the answer is definitely yes. Once you're on contract, once you win those first contracts, there's no better way to sell to the government than to just work closely with your contact there. Hey, is my software tool working for you guys? Or the guys that, are working in your office, are they doing what they're supposed to? Yeah, of course. Can you expand on what you're doing? Because if they like what you're doing, they're probably going to want more of it. And they can also recommend you to other offices. Acquisitions officers, they hang out with other acquisitions officers. So you're getting warm introductions to different offices, and it can become a lot more streamlined after.
That's so great. So what are some tips for small businesses to increase their chances of winning their first government contract?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It depends on what you're selling. But I think as a general rule, if you find the opportunity early, right? So through something like a source of SOT, like I mentioned, you are calling and talking with the office, right? You're creating that relationship and you're learning more about what the government is trying to do, who's using your service or potentially using your service, what's the use case. That's going to give you a lot more information, a lot more advantage if it does come down to you writing a proposal and the government, awarding, because you can also win a sole source contract that way without going through that process. So that is going to give you an advantage. Some other things that could give you an advantage is subcontracting is a great way to get past performance with the government. So if you do the work and find some of those opportunities early, like I was talking about, then you can you can use usaspending.gov again and find some other companies, not huge companies, but companies that let's say the VA, because we brought up the VA earlier. Well, if I'm trying to sell construction services to the VA, then I may go out and, look for another company that has done that and has past performance with the VA. And maybe there's something specific you do. Maybe you install Windows and you reach out to them like, look, I'm already in contact with the VA. We have this opportunity coming up. I'm a window guy, but they need foundations and all this other stuff. Maybe you guys can team up. And, if you approach a company that way, they're almost always going to be interested in working with you because you have that relationship. And as anyone that has been doing this for a while knows, that relationship is everything.
Yeah, 100%. Well, so tell me a little bit about what your services do. I think, you've given us a good framework of what it's like to be on your own. And it's like, okay, I'm excited about it, but then I'm like, oh, that sounds like a lot. So what is it that you and your team do?
Sure. So right now we have two main thrusts, I guess you could say. One is dodcontract.com, and that's our training and coaching platform, right? So that's where a lot of entrepreneurs, small business will come in, and we have weekly coaching and training that walk you through all of the steps and a lot of the strategies that we mentioned here. And there's a lot more that goes into that, but it basically gives them the foundation of knowledge to start from the beginning and go through the entire process. And then, as we talked a little bit about, we just launched GovClose, and that's GovClose, GovClose.com. And that's our new CRM and pipelining tool. And that is married up to some of that training. So it's essentially the pipeline, the steps. And so you can go right on, you can find your opportunity, and then you can just drop it in there and walk it through the steps and have all the training right there for you. So you're not guessing. And, and then you also have all the ability that a normal CRM and pipeline tool would give you. So with email and marketing and all of that stuff. So yeah, so that's really the two main thrusts. We do have some advanced services. So we work with clients one-on-one at a higher level, usually after you've won your first couple of contracts, and then we'll do different things for them. But I think for your listeners here, those are the two main things: dodcontract.com and govclose.com.
Great. Awesome. Thanks, Ricky. So I meant to ask earlier, you kept saying small businesses, and I find it very interesting in my world, that can mean a million different things. So from a government perspective, what does small business mean?
Yes, I keep saying that's a great question. I feel like I need another way to respond when you're asking me something. So the government does define the way small businesses are identified, and they're actually going back to those NAICS codes, those North American Industry Classification codes. The NAICS codes are going to be associated with one of two ways. So either you are going to be a small business if you have typically 500 people or less, you're a small business, or there are some NAICS codes that are associated with annual revenue. And typically it depends on what you're selling, but it's usually somewhere between 10 and 30 million a year. Could potentially put you into the larger business category, but there are a lot of parameters around those numbers, right? So I would say most businesses are going to, even if they're a business bringing, $5-10 million in a year, they're probably still considered small by the government's standards, right?
Yeah.
If I go onto usaspending.gov and I see a company that's bringing in $50 to $100 million a year or more, I'm thinking that that's probably a larger business.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do they have any restrictions on I'll call them mini businesses, right? Where it's like, maybe there's only 5 people, or maybe, the revenue is only, I don't know, a couple 100,000.
No, I mean, you have to have a business, a legal business. It has to be registered. In fact, a lot of our clients only have 4 or 5 people, and we have one, a woman-owned small business. She is in IT and cybersecurity, and they just won a $200 million blanket purchase agreement with the government. which
Wow.
means a few things. Doesn't mean they gave her a check for $200 million,
Right.
but it means that it could be worth that over the years as she's using that. So you can be a small business and have some very lucrative deals come in from the U.S. government and the federal agencies.
Yeah. Yeah. This has been very informative and educational for me, for sure. And I hope it is for the listeners as well. As we start to wrap up, is there any other tidbits or things that you think people should know about when they start thinking about going down this path for their business?
I think we covered the main points. So what I would say again, you could check out the podcast and get, find either businesses on there that are kind of like yours if you're looking for something specific to your industry, or, we have some getting started ones on there. So you can listen for free and probably get a lot of information and save a lot of time, like scraping the internet and trying to find different things. So that would be my first recommendation. Go check out usaspending.gov, try to get a sense of what the spending looks like. And then if you're serious about it, or you really want to get started and you want a group of people to help, dodcontract.com, where we can give you that training, or potentially just jumping in with a pipeline tool and start building, your pipeline and finding opportunities, and we'll walk you through the process.
Well, that's great. Thank you again, Richard, for your time and for your service, being in the Air Force, supporting our country. Really appreciate all that you've done. And I hope that our listeners find that this was very helpful. I know I'm going to start digging into it and figuring out what might be good for my business. So appreciate the information, and I hope you have a great day.
Thanks. You too. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you.